It's been a pretty long morning. It's a little moist and warm morning, but no worries. I've been limited to speak to you for only 2 hours. My name is Robin Ann Williams, and I'm a friend of Mark and Melissa's. And Colin and Sophie graciously asked me to say a few words about their parents today. The story begins in 1995, when Melissa and I both worked at the Legal Aid Society of Minneapolis. After we met, it did not take long for us to become more friends than colleagues. When Melissa started at Legal Aid, she and Mark already had their son, Colin. And Colin and I got to spend our first quality time together, courtesy of the 1996 government shutdown. I think President Biden may have been there for that. Mark and Melissa had planned a trip to Italy, but due to the shutdown, they could not get a passport for Colin. So I offered to stay with Colin so they could go. They picked a good week to be gone. It was the week that broke all the cold temperatures throughout the state of Minnesota, and at its worst, it was minus 34 degrees in the Twin Cities. For visitors from out of state, that was not the wind chill, that was the actual air temperature. Now, being a person who had never had children and who did not grow up in Minnesota, I did what any reasonable person would do. I dressed Colin for daycare in the warmest clothes I could find for him. In this case, fuzzy, flannel, footed pajamas. Daycare called me and asked if Colin was sick. I said, no, he's warm. Colin survived this indignity. Mark and Melissa did not fire me as a caregiver, and I learned that children do not wear sleepwear to daycare. Sophie came along about 1 year after the infamous pajamas incident. I was at Mark and Melissa's when Sophie came home from the hospital, and Sophie had the smallest of nicks on her little pinky finger from some of the medical care that she had received. I remember Colin poking his head over the baby carrier. He looked at Sophie and said, "She has an owie." Those are the first words that Colin uttered to Sophie. He was looking out for his baby sister, as he still does, and vice versa. I watched Sophie and Colin grow up. Now that they are both fully adulting, I know how thrilled their parents were whenever the kids made an appearance at the Hortman home. Sophie and Colin, I know you've heard it countless times since June 14, but your parents adored you and were proud of you. You have always carried yourselves well, and your dignity and grace over the last 2 weeks has been tremendous. The apples did not fall far from the trees. In the early years of our friendship, before I got married, I hung out a lot with Melissa and Mark, but they never made me feel like a third wheel. We ate meals together, I handed out Halloween candy at their house every year, and we even took a 5-day trip to Tokyo, and that included travel time. Back then, we were undaunted by jet lag or economy seats for trans-Pacific flights. And we developed many an inside joke during our Japan trip, including an X-rated one about a bear, which I will not tell in church, but find me after. I also door knocked with Melissa during her first runs for the State House. And the politicians in here know, I mean door knocked, not lit dropped. We door knocked. At first, it was a bit of a political terrain for Melissa, but she was undaunted. She always told voters when she disagreed with him, but I never saw incivility. More often than not, they would smile at Melissa and wave as she walked away from their front doors. Melissa would tell me when she thought someone was not going to vote for her, but in watching her interactions with voters, I wasn't so sure she was always right. In 2006, my husband Paul and I got married at Melissa's parents' house, and the 3 Musketeers became 4. We did what friends do. We ate together. We watched the Super Bowl. We celebrated birthdays, and we traveled. Melissa's parents, Harry and Linda, have a best friend couple too, And I think that Melissa, Mark, Paul, and I subconsciously emulated them. As my husband said this week, Melissa and Mark were the easiest friendships you could have. The four of us were pretty casual about making plans. One of us would text to propose dinner that evening or that weekend, and then would see each other. Usually the only no's we got were when Melissa had a political event, but Mark would join us if he wasn't going, or when Mark's or Melissa's extended families were in town for a visit. We've heard it already, billiards nights and poker nights were off limits for Mark. And also mentioned, Mark and Melissa belonged to the Gourmet Supper Club, comprising Melissa's law school friends and their spouses. Those evenings held a sacrosanct position on Mark and Melissa's calendars. The heart of Mark and Melissa's house was their kitchen. In the last 2 years, they remodeled their kitchen and they loved it. Prior to the remodel, Melissa asked me to come over to help her pick paint colors for the kitchen. And when I arrived, I was met with no fewer than 15 paint samples, all of which were beige. Melissa spent hours deciding what color of beige to paint her kitchen. Mark and Melissa had remodeled the mudroom adjoining the kitchen the year before, and the discussion really devolved when Melissa asked me if the beige in the mudroom was going to clash with the beige in the kitchen. And Mark watched all of this with great amusement as I tried to convince Melissa to paint her kitchen any color other than beige. Mark told me that she would never go for it, and he was right. Mark and Melissa were colorful people in many ways, but their kitchen is, to this day, beige. Melissa's career took off through the 2000s, and I always saw her as a balloon, bouncing around, but still tethered to the earth by Mark. During President Biden's administration, she was invited twice to the White House, and off she would go. Or she would bounce over to a Uniform Law Commission meeting, or to the governor's mansion. And then Melissa would come back to us and would get together for takeout Indian food. Early after their deaths, I heard Governor Walz say that Melissa had brought the book, Getting to Yes, to a high-level negotiation. Mark Hortman did not need to read that book. Mark was game for anything. He loved accompanying Melissa on her political trips. They were last at the White House in December 2024 for a holiday reception for state legislators. Mark honed in on the important stuff and told us that the Christmas cookies at the White House were excellent. He went to the 2024 Democratic National Convention with Melissa. Paul and I asked for real-time updates, and Mark texted us photographs and texts throughout the evening. And they would bring souvenirs home to me and Paul. Hershey's Kisses from the White House, or campaign signs from the National Convention. I do have one of those with me today that I wish to share with you. I wasn't sure how that would go over. But Mark was also happy to stay at home. He was engaged in his own career and hobbies. As we've referenced, his newest interest was baking sourdough bread, which tasted a lot better than his homemade beer. He was always proud of Melissa and vice versa, and they were never jealous of each other. Even in this day and age, a lot of men would be intimidated by, and I suspect were intimidated, by Melissa's formidable political talents and achievements. But not Mark. He'd wait for us, for Melissa, our balloon, to come back home, and then we would have drinks on the deck. I feel like the universe had our backs a little bit during our last dinner together. It was June 6th. And the governor had just called for a one-day special session of the legislature to pass Minnesota's budget bills. Melissa wanted Italian food, and we ended up at a little restaurant in Robbinsdale recommended to her by a staff member. It was unusually chilly for a June day, but we toughed it out and we sat outside. Throughout dinner, Melissa would get up to take a call from the governor's chief of staff or from legislators. Now, if I were sitting at dinner with friends and the governor called me, I'd be like, the governor's on the phone. But not Melissa. Melissa did this without any pretense or drama. And Mark was nonplussed. While she was gone on the phone, he'd lean back in his chair, he'd put his arm on the armrest, he'd prop his feet up against the chair legs, and we just kept talking about the stuff we liked to talk about: dogs, kids, and politics. We ordered one dessert that night with 4 spoons. And at 8:30 p.m., which was always Melissa's witching hour, she announced that it was time for her to go home and go to bed. As we walked to our cars in the chill of that June night, I thought to myself about what a lovely dinner we had had and how Paul and I looked forward to many more dinners this summer with Mark and Melissa. I thought to close my remarks today with a quote from a song. But Melissa liked ABBA, and Mark liked Led Zeppelin. And it takes a smarter person than I am to reconcile those 2 musical traditions. Instead, I'd like to read something from my father's funeral. My father died unexpectedly in 2004 in Maryland. Melissa Hortman dropped everything to fly to Maryland to be with me. And Mark Hortman caught everything so she could be with her friend. From Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. Some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. We are buried in sorrow right now, but I do believe that we will experience joy again, and Mark and Melissa would not want it any other way. Goodbye, my friends.